at the beginning, with a widow who believed her heart had nothing left to give. This is the story of the Lanterns of Snow Pass Inn. Tonight, we journey to the ancient mountain town of Liqiang in the province of Yunnan during the early years of Republican China. Here, beneath the watchful peak of Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, narrow canals wound through stone streets polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air carried the smell of yak butter tea, roasting chestnuts, and pine smoke drifting from 1,000 chimneys. Mule caravans arrived from Tibet and Tali bearing tea, salt, wool, and medicines, their bells announcing them long before their hooves ever touched the cobblestones. Merchants, scholars, and pilgrims found shelter beneath the same lanterns before continuing their journeys, each one certain their road was the hardest, each one wrong. Among the many inns of Liqiang, there was one that travelers remembered long after they had forgotten the road itself. It was neither the largest nor the finest. Its roof sagged a little beneath winter snow. One lantern beside the gate had been repaired so many times that no one could remember its original frame. The courtyard stones were uneven, worn into shallow grooves by decades of cartwheels, and the signboard had faded beneath years of mountain rain until the characters were more felt than read. Yet whenever weary travelers spoke of Liqiang, they always smiled when they mentioned Snow Pass Inn. For there was always hot tea upon the stove, a warm bowl of noodles waiting, and two kind faces to welcome strangers as though they were old friends. This is the story of Snow Pass Inn, and of the two lonely hearts who found one another there. Long before sunrise, when the stars still lingered above Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, Lin Qingshan was already awake. He swept fresh snow from the front steps before it hardened into ice. He filled the wood box beside the kitchen stove, fetched water from the canal, and checked every stall in the mule yard before the first caravan bells echoed through the sleeping town. Inside, his wife Mei-lien had already begun preparing breakfast. Steam drifted from bamboo baskets. Fresh dough rested beneath linen cloths. Garlic chives lay neatly chopped beside wild mountain mushrooms gathered only the day before. By dawn, the whole inn smelled of ginger, sesame oil, and slow-simmered broth. Travelers often claimed they knew they had reached Snow Pass Inn before they even saw it. They simply followed the aroma. The inn had belonged to Qingshan's father before him. It was never prosperous. Most years, it merely survived. Some winters, the roof leaked. Other years, the spring floods damaged the courtyard wall. Whenever money was finally saved for improvements, something else seemed to break first. Yet neither Qingshan nor Mei-lien complained. "The inn always comes before us," Qingshan liked to say. Mei-lien would laugh. "And who repairs the innkeeper?" He would pat his own chest. "Another bowl of your noodles." Ask them, in those years, how they had come to be married, and Qingshan would grow strangely shy for a man who could argue prices with hardened traders without blinking. It was Mei-lien who told it best. She had grown up in a farming village 3 days south, beyond the gorge where the river ran too fast and too narrow for boats. Her family grew barley and buckwheat on terraces cut into the hillside, and every autumn she walked those terraces, binding wheat into sheaves, singing to keep her hands moving in the cold. One autumn, a young man delivering blocks of salt for his father's inn lost the trail in a sudden fog and wandered, half frozen and thoroughly lost, into her family's fields. He heard her singing before he saw her. "I thought," he used to tell guests, "that I had died on the mountain and wandered into some better world." He thought no such thing, Mei-lien would correct him. He thought he was going to be scolded for trampling the wheat. That too. He had trampled quite a lot of wheat, in fact, and her father had indeed scolded him soundly. But her mother had fed him and dried his coat by the fire, and by the time the fog lifted the following morning, the salt trader's son found he was in no particular hurry to leave. He returned the next season with a proper marriage proposal, and, more importantly to her father, 3 sacks of good tea brick as apology for the wheat. Mei-lien said yes before her father had finished counting the sacks. They were married the following spring, and she left her mountain terraces for his mountain inn, trading one kind of hard, honest work for another. Neither of them ever called it a sacrifice. It was simply what love did, when it was young and certain of itself, and had a whole life still ahead of it to prove its choice correct. That certainty served them well, for the inn gave them little else to be certain of. The regular caravan men treated Snow Pass Inn almost like family. Tibetan traders arrived with shaggy pack animals carrying salt and wool. Merchants from Tali brought cloth, tea bricks, and medicinal herbs. Occasionally, a scholar from Kunming stopped for a night on his way into the western mountains, eager to collect old Naxi manuscripts or study the customs of the local people. Every guest was welcomed the same way: a bow, a smile, and hot tea before any discussion of payment. Cold men should drink first, Mei-lien always said. Accounts may wait. Her cooking had become quietly famous throughout the mountain roads. She prepared hand-pulled noodles in a broth rich with pork bones, ginger, and wild mushrooms. She served walnut cakes sweetened with brown sugar from the valleys below. On festival days, she simmered yak stew with pepper and mountain herbs for Tibetan traders who missed home. No traveler ever left hungry. Indeed, many admitted they planned their journeys so they might spend one more evening at Snow Pass Inn. Among the most faithful of these was a broad-shouldered Tibetan trader named Tashi, who had been stopping at Snow Pass Inn since before his beard had turned grey, and who considered it a point of personal honor to be defeated at Xiangqi by Qing Shan at least once every season. "You'll lose again tonight," Tashi would announce, settling his considerable frame onto the bench. "I usually do," Qing Shan replied. He almost never did. The little courtyard echoed with laughter as carved wooden horses, cannons, and generals marched across the board. Whenever Qing Shan captured an opponent's general, Mei-lien merely shook her head. "You told him to attack your horse 10 moves ago." "I was being polite." "You were setting a trap." "I prefer to call it encouragement." The courtyard burst into laughter. Not every evening was so lively. Sometimes traveling musicians passed through, carrying a worn pi-pa or hu. Sometimes an elderly Naxi storyteller entertained guests with legends of the mountains, while children sat cross-legged around the lanterns, listening with wide eyes. Sometimes everyone simply watched the moon reflected in the canals while sipping fragrant pu-er tea. Life moved gently in Liqiang, measured not by clocks, but by the changing seasons, by caravan bells, by lanterns lit at dusk, by the first snow upon Jade Dragon's snow mountain. For 23 years, Qing Shan and Mei-lien lived this way. They had never been blessed with children. At first, that sorrow had seemed almost unbearable. But over time, they came to think of the inn itself as their child. Every repaired beam, every polished table, every guest who returned year after year. It was enough. Not wealthy, not easy, but enough. And had anyone asked Mei-lien then what happiness looked like, she would simply have pointed toward the dining room, where her husband sat laughing over another impossible game of xiangqi, certain, as he always was, that this ordinary evening would simply repeat itself, gently, for as many years as the mountain allowed. The winter Qingshan died arrived before anyone expected. One afternoon, dark clouds gathered over Jade Dragon Snow Mountain, swallowing its brilliant white peak. By evening, heavy snow was falling across the whole valley. The streets emptied, the canals darkened. Even the mule bells sounded muffled beneath the thick blanket of snow. Just before sunset, a caravan finally reached the inn. Tashi's caravan, as it happened, though there was little of the usual cheer in it. The traders had struggled for hours through the mountain pass. One mule had slipped on the ice near the ridge. Several crates had broken loose and had to be dragged the last mile by hand. The men themselves looked scarcely warmer than the snow upon their hats. Without hesitation, Qingshan hurried outside. "Leave them," Mei-lien called. "You've been coughing all day." "They've had a harder journey than I have," he smiled. "I'll only be a few minutes." Those few minutes became nearly an hour. By the time the last bundle had been carried beneath shelter, snow covered Qingshan's shoulders. His hands trembled as he entered the kitchen. Mei-lien immediately wrapped him in dry blankets. "You see," she scolded gently, "you've frozen yourself." He smiled through another cough. "It is only mountain cold." Those were the words he always used. Only mountain cold. Only tiredness. Only another winter. By morning, the cough had deepened. That afternoon, fever followed. Mei-lien boiled ginger with garlic. She brewed bitter mountain herbs gathered by old Ho-Ah-Pu, the respected Nakshi herbalist, who examined Qingshan's pulse for a long while and said less than Mei-lien wished he had. She heated smooth river stones beside the stove and wrapped them in cloth for Qingshan's feet. For 3 days, she scarcely slept. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside the inn, the cheerful voices disappeared. The xiangqi board remained untouched beneath its cloth. Guests spoke only in whispers, and Tashi, who had delayed his own departure by 2 full days out of a worry he did not know how to voice, sat outside Qingshan's door each evening with his cap in his hands, saying nothing at all. On the 4th morning, before dawn, Mei-lien awoke. The room seemed strangely peaceful. No coughing, no restless turning, no quiet request to add another log to the fire. Only silence. She turned toward her husband. His face had softened into perfect rest, as though the mountain winds could trouble him no longer. Mei-lien reached for his hand. It had already grown cold. Mountain people understand grief. They know there are moments when words only disturb sorrow rather than comfort it. The funeral was small. The old caravan leaders came carrying incense. The noodle seller from the market bowed 3 times before Qingshan's spirit tablet. Ho-Ah-Pu stood silently with his cap held against his chest. Tashi wept openly, without shame, which surprised no one who had ever watched him lose gracefully at xiangqi for 20 years running. Someone placed the old xiangqi board beside the altar. Upon it rested a single carved general. No one explained why. No one needed to. After the prayers were finished, the guests returned to the roads. The neighbors reopened their shops. The mule caravans departed once more beneath the shadow of Jade Dragon Snow Mountain. Only Mei-lien remained. Snow Pass Inn had never seemed so large or so quiet. At first, work distracted her. There was rice to wash, floors to sweep, tea to brew, guests to feed. The roof still leaked above the upstairs corridor whenever rain fell heavily. The old gate still stuck each morning. Firewood still needed splitting. Life continued, whether one was ready or not. Spring came. Business did not. Mei-lien quietly sold her jade hairpin. A month later, she sold Qing Shan's heavy winter coat. Then an old brass basin that had belonged to his mother. Each sale felt less like losing a possession and more like saying farewell all over again. One evening, she carried supper into the dining room. Without thinking, she placed 2 bowls upon the table, 2 pairs of chopsticks, 2 teacups. Steam curled gently into the evening air. She stood looking at them for several long moments. Then, very slowly, she carried 1 bowl back into the kitchen. Halfway there, her hands began to shake. The bowl slipped. Broth splashed across the floor. For the first time since the funeral, Mei-lien wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, simply with the weary sorrow of someone who had spent too many months pretending to be brave. It was not long after this that Wang Fu began paying his visits. Wang Fu owned the largest trading house on the eastern side of Lijiang, a business built on tea bricks, opium medicine, and an instinct honed over many years for knowing exactly when a person was too tired to argue. He had watched Snow Pass Inn's fortunes decline with the patient interest of a man who collects debts the way other men collect stamps. He arrived one afternoon in a fine wool coat, entirely unsuited to mountain travel, accompanied by a servant carrying an even finer teapot as a gift. "Widow Lin," he said, using a title Mei-lien had not yet grown accustomed to hearing. "I come only as a concerned neighbor." "You are very kind to trouble yourself," Mei-lien replied, in the flat tone reserved for guests she did not entirely trust. An inn is heavy work for a woman alone. The roof, the accounts, the bandits on the Tali road grow bolder each season, I hear, and a widow with no sons to protect her— "I manage," Mei-lien said. Of course. He smiled, and set upon the counter a sum of silver considerably larger than the inn, in its finest year, had ever earned. "But should managing ever become too heavy a burden, my offer for this land will remain open. I would build a fine warehouse here. The location is excellent." "This is not land," Mei-lien said quietly. "It is my husband's inn." Wang Fu's smile did not falter. "Land outlives sentiment, Widow Lin. It always has." He bowed with perfect courtesy and departed, leaving the silver untouched upon the counter, as though its presence alone might do the persuading his words could not. Mei-lien did not sell. But that night, for the first time, she found herself doing sums by lamplight that frightened her far more than any ghost story old Ho-Ah-Poo had ever told the children by the fire. Summer rains arrived at last. The ancient stone streets shone like polished jade beneath the steady drizzle. For 3 days, scarcely a traveller appeared. Mei-lien had begun wondering whether she might close the inn for a few days to save on firewood, a thought that, a year earlier, would have seemed as unlikely as the mountain itself packing up and leaving. Late one rainy afternoon, the gate creaked open. A tall man stood beneath the weathered lantern. His travelling coat was worn but carefully mended. Silver touched his temples. Across his back, he carried a long bamboo case wrapped in oiled cloth. He looked less like a merchant and more like a scholar who had wandered farther than he had ever intended. He bowed politely. "Does Snow Pass Inn still have a room?" Mei-lien returned the bow. "There is one upstairs," she hesitated. "The roof leaks in heavy rain." The stranger looked toward the old building, then smiled. "Then I shall hope the rain shows mercy." For the first time in many months, Mei-lien almost smiled herself. "My name is Chao Tzu Yuen," he said. "I should like to stay 3 nights." She showed him upstairs. That evening she served him mushroom noodles, pickled greens, and a pot of dark pu-er tea. He ate slowly, not because he disliked the meal, but because he seemed to savor every mouthful. When he finished, he placed his chopsticks neatly beside the bowl. "You cook with great kindness," he said quietly. Mei-lien lowered her eyes. "My husband used to say, 'Hungry travelers are generous judges.'" "Then your husband was a wise man." His eyes drifted briefly toward the empty chair beneath the lantern, the untouched xiangqi board, the second teacup still standing beside the stove. He understood, but he asked nothing. And somehow that silence was the kindest thing he could have offered. The 3 days passed quietly. Each morning, before the town had fully awakened, Chao Tzu Yuan left the inn, carrying only his notebook and the long bamboo case. Sometimes Mei-lien watched from the upstairs window as he wandered beside the canals, stopping to admire carved wooden balconies or speak with elderly craftsmen whose families had lived in Liqiang for generations. On other days, he climbed the hill overlooking the town, where the first light of dawn turned Jade Dragon's snow mountain from pale blue to brilliant white. He always returned before supper, always with the same gentle smile, and always with fresh stories of the town. On the morning of the 4th day, Mei-lien prepared his account. Instead, Chao Tzu Yuan placed several silver dollars upon the counter. "If the room is still available," he said, "I should like to remain another week." Mei-lien looked up. "Business must be poor elsewhere." He smiled. "I have traveled through many inns, and very few feel like home." 1 week became 2, then another. He never interfered, never imposed himself, yet somehow his quiet presence seemed to settle naturally into the life of Snow Pass Inn. One afternoon, as rain beat against the shutters, Mei-lien struggled to force one warped window closed. Without a word, Chao Tzu Yuan fetched a small carpenter's plane from his satchel. Carefully, he shaved a few curls of wood from the swollen frame. The shutter closed perfectly. "You've done this before," Mei-lien observed. "My father built houses." "And you?" He believed every educated man should also know how to use his hands. A few days later, he noticed the kitchen knives had become dull. By evening, they sliced vegetables as though cutting silk. He repaired a loose stair rail, straightened a cupboard door, fixed the squeaking gate, even patched one of the roof gutters before the next storm arrived. "You are a guest," Mei-lien protested. "I begin to wonder. I have stayed in places where broken things remained broken for years." "And this place?" He looked around the old courtyard. "This inn deserves better." "It is only an old building." "No," he shook his head gently. "It is someone's life's work." Those words remained with Mei-lien long after he had returned upstairs. One evening, she carried tea into the courtyard. Chao Tzu Yuan sat alone beneath the lanterns. Before him rested a wei-qi board. Black and white stones covered half its surface. "You play alone?" she asked. He smiled. "I used to have an opponent." She thought he might explain. Instead, he quietly placed another white stone upon the board. Mei-lien poured tea. Neither spoke again until darkness settled over Li-kiang. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. As summer ripened, the caravan roads grew busy once more. The bells of approaching mules once again echoed through the narrow streets. Travelers returned. Then more arrived. Word had quietly spread that Snow Pass Inn still served the finest meals in Li-kiang. Some merchants even altered their routes simply to spend another evening there. The dining room came alive once more. Steam rose from bowls of mushroom noodles. Walnut cakes disappeared almost as quickly as Mei-lien could bake them. The rich aroma of yak stew filled the courtyard whenever Tibetan traders stopped overnight. Pots of dark pu'er tea seemed never to empty. The old inn breathed again. One warm evening, a group of Naxi musicians arrived unexpectedly. One carried an erhu, another a pi-pa. A third brought only bamboo flutes wrapped carefully in cloth. After supper, one musician began playing softly. Another joined. Soon, the courtyard filled with music so gentle that even the canal seemed to pause and listen. Guests stopped talking. Children wandered closer. Tashi, who had returned with the new season's caravan and taken one look at the freshly mended gate with obvious suspicion, sighed quietly. I had forgotten how beautiful Li-kiang sounds at night. Mei-lien realized she had forgotten too. Business continued improving. Without ever being asked, Chao Tzu Yuan quietly began keeping the inn's accounts. He discovered one flour merchant had slowly increased his prices for nearly a year. He found a cheaper supplier of lamp oil. He convinced several caravan leaders to reserve rooms before arriving each winter. Snow Pass Inn, for the first time in years, began earning a modest profit. "You have a talent for figures," Mei-lien remarked. "My wife used to say I counted everything," he smiled faintly. "Except blessings." The words hung gently in the evening air. "You were married?" "I was." Nothing more. Mei-lien did not ask. Some sorrows introduced themselves only when they were ready. The old Xiang Qi board eventually returned to the courtyard. One evening, several caravan men looked toward Qing Shan's empty chair. No one wished to sit there. Finally, Chao Tzu Yuan quietly took the seat. "I should warn you," he said. "I lose with dignity." Within an hour, he had defeated every one of them. The courtyard erupted with laughter. "You are worse than Qing Shan." Another scholar pretending not to know the game. Mei-lien laughed. A full, warm laugh she had not heard from herself in over a year. The sound surprised everyone, most of all her. Li-kiang was a small town, and small towns are rarely content to let a widow's quiet happiness remain unremarked upon. It began gently enough. A comment from the vegetable seller about how well the widow Lin was looking these days. A knowing glance exchanged between two women washing clothes at the canal. But Wang Fu, who had watched his silver sit untouched upon the counter for a full year, found in these whispers an opportunity worth cultivating. A stranger with no family, no trade, no fixed home, he remarked to anyone who would listen. Over tea he did not need to pay for. One wonders what such a man is truly after. An inn, a widow's savings. It would not be the first time. The words traveled, as words in small towns do, faster than any caravan. They reached Mei-lien on a grey afternoon, carried gently but unmistakably by an elderly guest who considered it a kindness to warn her. That evening, she watched Chao Zhu Yuan from across the dining room as he helped an old woman fold her wet coat by the fire, and for the first time since his arrival, she felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the season. What did she truly know of him? A name, a wife he never spoke of, a skill with tools and figures that seemed, now that she considered it, remarkably convenient for a man who had wandered in with nothing but a bamboo case. She said nothing that night, but the next morning, when he offered to negotiate a better price with the charcoal seller on her behalf, she found herself answering more sharply than she intended. "I managed my accounts for a year before you arrived. I shall manage them a while longer." Chao Zhu Yuan studied her for a long moment and did not argue. "Of course," he said simply, and did not raise the subject again. For several days, the warmth between them cooled. He continued his small repairs. She continued her cooking. But the easy silences of the summer had become something more careful, more guarded, as though both of them had quietly stepped back from a door neither was certain they should open. It was Tashi, of all people, who finally said what needed saying. He found Mei-lien alone in the kitchen one evening, scrubbing a pot that did not require nearly so much scrubbing. "Wang Fu wants your land," he said bluntly, in the manner of a man who had never learned to soften bad news. "And it is easier to frighten a woman away from a friend than to make her a fair offer for a home she loves. Ask yourself, Widow Lin, which of these two men has ever asked you for anything in return?" Mei-lien set down the pot. She thought of Wang Fu's silver sitting untouched, patient as a debt collector. And she thought of Chao Zhu Yuan mending a swollen window frame for no reason except that the inn deserved better. She found her answer rather more quickly than she expected. Late summer brought the annual Torch Festival. As evening descended upon Liqiang, lanterns glowed from every balcony and bridge. Children carried paper rabbits and lotus flowers lit by tiny candles. Families gathered beside the canals. Vendors roasted chestnuts over charcoal braziers. The air smelled of sesame cakes, grilled river fish, and pine smoke. Snowpass Inn was full. Every room occupied, every table filled. Long after the last guest had retired, Mei-lien and Chao Zhu Yuan remained beneath the courtyard lanterns. Tiny lantern boats drifted slowly along the canal beyond the wall. Mei-lien poured the last of the tea. Then she smiled, a small apology folded into it that she did not know how to voice aloud. "I have one question. I shall try to answer honestly. You have carried that bamboo case every day since arriving." "I have." "What is inside?" For a long while, he remained silent. Finally, he untied the worn cord. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside rested an old erhu. Its polished wood had become smooth through years of careful hands. The bow had been repaired several times. One tuning peg had clearly been replaced long ago. Yet it was lovingly cared for. "It belonged to my wife." Mei-lien looked up. "You never mentioned her." "I seldom do." She waited. After a long silence, he continued. "We traveled together for many years." "She played?" He nodded. "And I taught village children wherever work could be found." "What happened?" His eyes remained upon the instrument. "There was a bandit attack on the road between Ta-li and Yunping." He paused. "They wanted the caravan's silver." Nothing more needed saying. Mei-lien lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." "So was I." He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw, plainly, the full weight of everything he had carried alone across so many provinces. I have carried her instrument through every province since, because I could not bear to leave the last part of her behind. And I could not bear to play it either, not once, not in 3 years. Why not? Because the moment I finished, she would truly be gone. Without another word, he lifted the erhu. The first note floated gently into the summer night. It sounded like mist rising across distant mountains, like old memories carried by the wind, like someone finally finding the courage to remember without breaking. Guests quietly opened their upstairs windows. The caravan men emerged into the courtyard. Even those passing outside the inn stopped beside the gate. Mei-lien stood beneath the lantern light. Tears slowly filled her eyes. Not because the melody reminded her of Qing Shan's death, but because it reminded her of something she had forgotten. That grief and gratitude could live together inside the same heart, and that a man who had finally found the courage to play could be trusted in every way that mattered with hers. Autumn painted the poplar trees gold. The skies above Jade Dragon's Snow Mountain became impossibly clear. One crisp morning, several laborers arrived carrying fresh roof tiles and heavy timber. Mei-lien hurried outside. "There must be some mistake." "There is none," Chao Zhu Yuan replied. "You did what?" "Hired them. The roof will not survive another winter." "I cannot allow you to pay for this." "It is not charity." "What then?" He smiled. "I am investing in an inn I hope will still be welcoming travelers long after both of us are gone." She looked at him for several long moments. Then she laughed. "You are the most stubborn guest Snow Pass Inn has ever known." "So I have often been told." Word of the repairs reached Wang Fu within the week, as word of everything in Liqiang eventually did. He arrived at the gate that same afternoon, his fine wool coat entirely unsuited, as always, to the honest work of mountain living. "Widow Lin, I hear you are spending a stranger's silver on a roof that was, until recently, worth so little that you considered selling the whole property to me." "The roof was never for sale," Mei-lien said. "Only your understanding of it was mistaken." Wang Fu's eyes moved to Chao Zhu Yuan, who had set down his tools and was watching the exchange with the calm, unhurried patience of a man who had faced considerably worse than an unhappy merchant in a fine coat. "And you, sir, what is your interest here, precisely?" "The same as any guest who has been treated kindly," Chao Zhu Yuan said, "and wished to return the kindness. Though I confess I am curious, Wang Fu, why a man of your considerable wealth troubles himself so persistently over one small, sagging inn." Wang Fu had no ready answer for this. He gathered what remained of his dignity, bowed with rather less courtesy than his previous visits, and did not return again. For the next 2 weeks, the old inn echoed with the sound of hammers. Broken beams were replaced. The leaning gate was straightened. Fresh roof tiles covered the weathered rafters. The cracked lantern beside the entrance was carefully repaired once more instead of replaced. "It has greeted too many travelers," Chao Zhu Yuan said. "It deserves to continue." When the work was finished, Snow Pass Inn still looked old, still humble, still wonderfully itself. Only now it stood a little straighter, rather like Mei-lien. As autumn evenings grew cooler, travelers lingered in the courtyard long after supper. Children chased one another beneath the lanterns. Caravan men argued cheerfully over games of xiangqi. The musicians returned whenever their journeys brought them through Liqiang. Sometimes, after the last bowl had been washed and the final lantern trimmed, Mei-lien and Chao Zhu Yuan simply sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the quiet murmur of the canals flowing through the ancient town. Neither spoke of tomorrow, neither spoke of the future. For the first time in many years, tomorrow had become something worth looking forward to. Winter returned to Liqiang as quietly as an old friend. One morning, Mei-lien opened the front door to find the courtyard transformed. Fresh snow rested upon the stone walls. The tiled rooftops shimmered white beneath the early light. Beyond the town, Jade Dragon's snow mountain rose into a sky as clear as polished crystal. She smiled to herself. Qing Shan had always loved the first snowfall. He would have been outside already, broom in hand, clearing the path before the guests awoke. "The snow is patient," he used to say. "It can wait for us." The memory came gently now. It no longer pierced her heart as it once had. Instead, it settled quietly beside it, like an old friend who never truly leaves. That morning, Chao Zhu Yuan descended the staircase carrying his traveling cloak. Across his shoulder rested the familiar bamboo case. Mei-lien felt something tighten within her. "You are leaving?" He nodded. "The mountain passes will soon become dangerous." He looked toward the white peaks. "If I delay much longer, I may not cross them until spring." Of course. Travelers always left. Snow Pass Inn existed because people came and went. She had known this since she was a young bride. Yet somehow she had forgotten. Breakfast passed almost in silence. Outside, mule bells echoed faintly through the snowy streets as another caravan assembled beyond the town gate. When the meal was over, Chao Zhu Yuan placed a small cloth purse upon the counter. "For my lodging." Mei-lien gently pushed it back toward him. "You have already paid." "I insist." "So do I." He smiled. "It seems we are evenly matched." She almost laughed. "Not at xiangqi." "No," he admitted. "Certainly not there." The morning grew brighter. The time for departure had come. Chao Zhu Yuan lifted his pack. He bowed, then slowly walked toward the front gate. Mei-lien stood beneath the repaired lantern, watching him go. The inn already felt quieter. At the gate, Chao Zhu Yuan stopped. Snow drifted softly between the lanterns. For a long moment, he stood looking out toward the mountain road. Then he turned back. "There is one question I have never asked." Mei-lien waited. He walked slowly across the courtyard until they stood only a few steps apart. "I have wandered for many years," he said, his voice calm. "I have crossed provinces, taught in village schools, stayed in monasteries, slept in caravan camps. I thought that wandering would be the rest of my life." He rested one hand upon the bamboo case. But somewhere along the way, his eyes lifted toward the inn. This place stopped feeling like an inn. It began feeling like home. Neither spoke. Only the gentle sound of snow landing upon the courtyard stones. "I have no family waiting elsewhere," he said quietly. "Nor do I," Mei-lien replied. "I have no wish to spend another winter among strangers." She lowered her eyes. The old inn surrounded them. The repaired roof, the warm kitchen, the xiangqi board waiting beneath the lantern, the chair where Qing Shan had once laughed until tears came to his eyes. She loved those memories. She always would. Nothing could replace them. Nothing ever should. Slowly, she understood something her sorrow had hidden for many months. Love was not a vessel that emptied when shared. It was a lantern. Its light could welcome another traveler without growing dimmer. She looked back at Chao Tzu Yuan. This old inn still leaks whenever the spring rains are especially heavy. A smile spread slowly across his face. Then we shall mend it together. For the first time since Qing Shan's death, Mei-lien reached out her hand. He took it gently, not with the excitement of youth, but with the quiet gratitude of two people who had traveled long roads before finding one another. Outside the gate, the snow continued falling upon old Liqiang. Inside Snow Pass Inn, winter no longer felt lonely. The years passed as mountain years always do, quietly. The caravans continued to arrive from Tali, Tibet, and the valleys beyond. Pilgrims, merchants, musicians, scholars, weary travelers from roads that seemed to have no end. Tashi's son took over his father's route eventually and made a point, every season, of losing at least one game of xiangqi to the old scholar by the gate, for reasons he could never quite explain to his own children. Wang Fu's warehouse was built on the far side of town instead, on land that flooded twice a year, which the people of Liqiang considered, quietly, to be a fitting sort of justice. Most came because they had heard stories of Snow Pass Inn. Some spoke of Mei-lien's mushroom noodles. Others praised her walnut cakes. Many insisted no tea in all of Yunnan tasted quite like the dark pu'er served beside the fire on winter evenings. Yet those who returned year after year rarely spoke first about the food. They spoke about the feeling. Somehow, everyone who entered Snow Pass Inn felt less alone than when they had arrived. No one could quite explain why. On snowy evenings, the dining room glowed with lantern light. Children gathered near the fire, listening to old Nashi legends. The scent of ginger, mushrooms, and fresh bread drifted through the beams overhead. Near the window, an elderly gentleman patiently taught curious youngsters the mysteries of Wei Qi. Occasionally, he allowed them to win. Only occasionally. Across the room, an elderly lady moved quietly from table to table, filling teacups before anyone thought to ask. Guests often assumed they had been husband and wife since they were young. If anyone asked how long they had been married, they exchanged a knowing smile. "Oh," one would answer, "long enough." The other would nod, and not nearly long enough. The guests usually smiled without understanding. The couple never explained. Snow Pass Inn never became famous beyond the mountain roads. It never grew wealthy. Its floors still creaked. Its old signboard still swayed whenever the winter wind descended from Jade Dragon's snow mountain. Now and then, a roof tile still slipped after heavy storms. There was always another repair waiting. Neither Mei-lien nor Chao Tzu Yuan minded. Some places were not meant to become grand, only welcoming. Years later, an old caravan leader stopped at the inn with his grandson. The boy looked around the cozy dining room. "Grandfather," he whispered, "why does everyone smile here?" The old man warmed his hands around a bowl of tea. Then he looked toward the two elderly innkeepers moving quietly about their work. "Because," he said softly, "the people who keep this place know what it is to be lonely, and they have decided that no traveler who passes through their doors should ever feel that way again. The boy nodded thoughtfully. He never forgot those words. Sometimes the greatest blessing is not finding love for the first time. It is discovering, after grief has done its work, that the heart still has room to welcome another weary traveler, and the quiet courage to open the gate.
Thank you for joining me for another journey into the forgotten worlds of old Asia. If this story brought a little warmth to your evening, I'd be delighted if you left a like, subscribed to the Oriental Story Hour, and shared your thoughts in the comments below. Until our next journey beneath the lantern light, good night.